Brandon Thurston from Wrestlenomics is up next, and we're going to follow Brandon with John Pollock from Post Wrestling.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone.
But we can't ignore the math, okay? We can't ignore the data.
Go on Google Trends, type in your name, then type in mine. You're a straight line. I'm a pyramid.
I like the very direct question on that.
Television ratings, downward spiral. Buy rates, plummeting.
The time is now to turn the math around.
And welcome to this week's special Thursday edition of Pollock and Thurston. John Pollock and Brandon Thurston with you for the next hour or so, where we are going to talk about the Netflix series that everyone is talking about, pro wrestling being given the big spotlight treatment. Yes, it's going to be a full hour plus on Dump Matsumoto, the history of All Japan Women, and we're going to go into from the beauty pair to the crush gals to the 90s resurgence, all of that. We have got you covered.
Yeah, Jackie Sato, she was one half of the beauty pair, correct? I was looking through the Observer Hall of Fame list of inductees and realizing that the only woman who's inducted who is not a Japanese wrestler is Mildred Burke, in fact.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. Well, can't disagree with Mildred Burke's.
It's almost election season again.
It is. The beauty pair only went in as a duo last year because Jackie Sato had been in the original class, but didn't get the Maki Ueda did not get the treatment as well. That is for another week. I actually highly recommend the Queen of Villains series. I did have a chance to watch that over the last week, but I know why everyone is here. It is for us to talk, dissect, and decode Vince McMahon over the course of 6 hours. I don't know about you, Brandon. I know you watched all 6 episodes on Wednesday, as did I, and I am not exaggerating that I had a headache by the end of 5 episodes, and I needed to just go out for a walk. This to me would not be the series I recommend people sit down and binge from start to finish. This is like a several week-long process in ideal form, but we had to get this done for today, and there was a lot of Vince McMahon overload from this series for me personally.
Yeah, it was a lot of Vince McMahon. I mean, it's interesting that these are new interviews with him, which he's rarely doing interviews, right? He's done the Pat McAfee interview. He's done the Steve Austin interview in 2014. So we don't get very many new interviews of Vince McMahon speaking. But yeah, it was. Did you watch it on half speed, on full speed, or not half speed, but 1.25x, 1.5x? I watched some of it on 1.25x.
I started at 1.2x, and then we graduated to 1.3x for the for the latter portions of it, and that was my speed.
Okay, I was impressed that Netflix has right in its own interface. You can watch it at different speeds. I was impressed with that.
It's standard protocol now. People mocked me years ago when this was my preferred method of not just watching but listening, and now it's part and parcel. Like
that's how you get ahead. That's how you overachieve.
That's it. So we are going to be joined a little later on into the show by David Bixenspan, who has lots to discuss from these 6 episodes. And this is kind of going to be we'll be all over the place here with some of our thoughts on big topics, small topics, what was covered, what could have been given more depth, the subjects that were interviewed, those that were not interviewed, and we'll open it up to you as well. If you have super chats or just questions that you want to filter in, we will be monitoring the comment section, and if possible, we'll be going in there as well. So I guess your overall impressions, Brandon, going into this is, the biggest, I think, critique many had was the fact that this was going to be landing on Netflix, who was about to embark on a multi-billion-dollar, potentially 20-year arrangement with WWE. Are they going to be putting on the kid gloves here to handle this disgraced figure from WWE's history? And let's start with this. If you are WWE and you had your concerns about this documentary and having seen the reaction to it, do you feel that the current management of TKO WWE would be upset with this portrayal?
I don't think so. I think it's fine, right? Like, I think WWE doesn't want this to be released anyway. But if you're going to do a 6-hour documentary on Vince McMahon, this was okay. I mean, Paul Levesque doesn't come off poorly here. Nick Khan is not in this at all. Stephanie is in it. I don't know if we want to get there yet, but I think she comes off a bit naive at the time that these interviews are being recorded. It'd be interesting to hear from her now. But she's not an executive with the company anyway. But there's,
really the only current, I would say, employee that comes off poorly to me would be Bruce Pritchard.
And he's the only current employee who's interviewed after even the 2022 Wall Street Journal reporting. Nobody's interviewed. I don't know when Dave Meltzer's interviews were recorded, but other than that, nobody's interviewed after the Janelle Grant lawsuit itself has been filed.
Yeah, it almost makes you wonder what the circumstances were. That was Bruce Pritchard a compromise that, Vince is gone. We need something.
Vince apparently canceled his interviews.
Vince canceled his interviews after the allegations first came out in June of 2022. And that's where this documentary, largely, so much of this was wrapped up by that point. And then the allegations occur, and you get this sort of the start of the documentary is acknowledging the accusations and the lawsuit right out of the bat. There's interviews, newer interviews with Ted Mann and Joe Palazzolo, and then Khadija Savtar in episode 6. Where
I think about one soundbite, I think, is all we get from Khadija.
Yeah, this is... you can't say they did not cover the allegations, but they had very little to work with. And it was sort of now we're in the post-Vince world, but you're not going to hear Vince's perspective post-June 2022. And the one person kind of in his orbit that is sent out there to kind of be the sacrificial lamb here is Bruce Pritchard, who is going to be a Vince loyalist to the end. And that's how he comes off in this.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear for people who haven't seen it yet, as far as anything addressing all the news and scandals that have come out since June of 2022, that's only addressed. It's addressed at the very beginning in the first 5 minutes or so, and then it's not addressed again until the second half of the final of the 6 episodes. So as I was having a conversation with you, as I was early in the final episode, saying I don't know if they're going to touch on it that much. I'm worried that they're not, but they did. But it's only half, right? And it's a lot of the material that is most contemporary, most interesting at this point, particularly the family dynamics at this point. All of that is unknown still. And I think it's the problem that all of these biographies of various kinds and documentaries about Vince, whether there was the Vice documentary that I was a part of, these are all attempts at telling the story as the final chapters of the story have yet to be written. So it has that inherent issue with it. But I agree, this is not a hagiography. This was a fairly, if we're forgetting about everything that has happened since 2022, this is a fairly open account of his life and career. Could have gone into more depth in places that people like us would be curious about. But you also had Vince McMahon being challenged about things like how can you say that Ted Turner was unfairly trying to hurt you when you did the same thing to the territories. And I hope we don't have to talk too much about this, but there was some WrestleMania 3 discussion in there as well. So just to say that, look, the things that are usually pointed out as exaggerations or lies or whatever, these things were brought to Vince to respond to.
I thought he was challenged in several regards where I didn't think Vince McMahon came off very well when he was pushed to defend his opinions and his stance on certain subjects.
He had to talk about Rita Chatterton. He had to talk about unionization.
Yeah, this is we have rounded up several clips, and this is one that I think has received a lot of attention when he is asked about Rita Chatterton.
When you're accused of rape, you're a rapist. But it was consensual, and actually, had it been a rape, the statute of limitations had run out. So, I mean, it's all kind of crap like that people are digging up and trying to find something on you.
Came off very, very poorly, and I would state that whenever you are defending yourself against a rape accusation, using the line, but if it had been rape, that is where your team in the background is screaming, Vince, I think you have to go to the bathroom.
Sounds a little too much like an O.J. Simpson book title.
If I did it. I just thought that was just so... Like, it was just awful. That, I think, even if you want to give benefit of the doubt, I think that line right there, very hard when you know that this was done in, pre-2022. And the fact is that in New York, the statute of limitations was that window was opened, and boom, he settles with Rita Chatterton. I mean, it does not paint Vince very well in this, and I think many people will draw their conclusions from that. He did himself no favors by using that justification. That I don't think too many people would be putting that caveat at the end of a defense.
And I think there's a good montage at one point, I forget which episode it is, where they run through things that people sort of classically remember, like the forcing Trish Stratus to bark and all of that, and going through all the different scenes that he's cast himself in, where he's been in positions with women physically and things like that. It really stood out to me, when they're showing this, this storyline where Linda McMahon is in a wheelchair because they've drugged her, and he's in this storyline relationship with Trish Stratus, and there's this one scene where they're at a house or something, it's from WWE programming at the time, and he says, "Did you double up Linda's dosage?" Which is like eerily similar to what Janelle Grant is suggesting, if not accusing him of doing, in that she was prescribed medicine, supplements, something that she doesn't know exactly what she was being given by this doctor that she was directed to go to at Vince's direction.
Yeah, we had several of those sort of storyline depictions of real life events. There's a Mickie James angle where she fakes being assaulted by a male. This shortly after the whole Tanzabar incident in 2006. There is a clip of him kind of embarrassing and forcing Ashley Massaro into tears, and later it would come out about him making advances at Ashley Massaro, as well as Ashley Massaro's own testimony to Konstantin Kairos in that sworn affidavit that she had been raped overseas. I mean, there's lots of those incidents that I'm sure that is a lot of what Vince McMahon was leaning on in this statement he put out on Monday about editing tricks to, I think, emphasize a point. Like, there are a lot of contradictions by Vince McMahon that are sort of proven out when, even down to the simplest of, well, we never had murder on the show, we never had rape, and you just have clip after clip of the guy just looking like a hypocrite here. And that, to me, is not an editing trick. That is just simply proof being thrown into the face of someone who is not telling the truth on camera.
Yeah, and I think it's important if we could, say that the documentary fell short of one thing concerning the scandals of the last few years. It's, the complaint itself that was filed in January. It's not like they go into detail about that, okay? But even beyond that, I would say it's important to point out that it's not just that he was alleged of assaulting someone in a tanning salon in Boca Raton in 2006. It's not just that Janelle Grant accuses him of terrible things, including sex trafficking and sexual assault, but there's also the spa manager in California in 2011 that he allegedly assaulted, and Rita Chatterton, which is addressed, but also the 2008 WWE contractor, the 2006 WWE manager, the 2005 WWE wrestler is mentioned in here. But it's just, I think it's important to list all of those things. Like, this is not just, it's not just Rita Chatterton
incidents. Yeah,
it's not just Rita Chatterton and Janelle Grant, but there's, the reason why so many people in the public are finding it easy to believe that Vince may have done some really, really terrible things is because there is a number of women. Maybe you could believe that one or two are making something up, but there's a number of women that he has paid millions of dollars for their silence because they raised allegations of sexual misconduct against him.
Yeah, I think it's kind of painting that entire picture, and that this documentary, I thought, like, one of the issues they were going to run into is that you have 6 episodes, and yes, that sounds like you have all this infinite time to go into all of these stories, and you had a case of, are you going to try and cover as many key stories as possible, or are you going to really go into depth in all of them? Because so many of these subjects, you could go so much further on, but in the absence of that, you avoid the fact that, if if we want to spend 20 minutes on Montreal, well, then there's going to be the criticism that, well, they didn't even address Chris Benoit or something like that because there would not be the time for it. I can understand that criticism, though, is that for many of these subjects, you want to kind of go a bit further, and instead it was covering just, there's so much to cover over that period when you're just talking about the last 40 years, much less the childhood of Vince McMahon and all these other aspects to it.
Yeah. In terms of the childhood, we did get a little bit of Vince talking about, just sort of one of the common themes of I don't know, Western manhood in the 20th century of, he had a father who he was disconnected from until he was 12. But even then they weren't especially close in terms of being affectionate with one another. He tells this story about how, I think this is something that he also mentioned in the Playboy interview in 2001, that his father did not tell him that he loved him until the day that he died. Which, that maybe along with what he seemed to, he used the word incest at one point in reference to his childhood. He used it very briefly in passing in a list of things, but he seems to be, suggesting that he was a victim of incest as a child. So, there's things like that about his childhood. As far as, you want to talk about like the statement that Vince made before this documentary was released, where he's raising that there have been all of these editing tricks. He's objected to the notion that this is a documentary that shows him and his on-screen character, Mr. McMahon, as one and the same, which it basically does. They do go through this montage of clips where they're asking all of these different wrestlers, is he the same? And you get a variety, a range of responses. Yes, they're exactly the same. No, they're totally different, etc. And I would say, I don't know that we get a strong sense of who he is here, right? You get at one point where he's challenged about the hypocrisy of painting himself as a victim of unfair practices as Ted Turner is trying to attack him. Compare that to the territory days. And he says something, I did pull that clip, so I'll just play this clip. This is how he responds when the producer asks him if that's not the same thing.
You didn't look at what Ted was doing as competing?
Sure did.
But you said that your philosophy is different than Ted's, like he's trying to hurt the person.
Correct. Some would think it might be hypocritical for me to say, okay, I don't hurt someone else, I just do what's best for me. Yet when someone comes after me, I don't think they have the right. Sure, they have the right. Again, what I say a lot of times is totally different than what I think. And the public doesn't understand that sometimes. As a businessman, you have to throw things out there. It's not really the way you feel, but it controls thought process by doing that.
It's just this weird moment where he like openly says he's being duplicitous, and you combine that with what happens early in this documentary where he says, I'm not going to tell you the real stories. Those stories are too crazy. I'm not going to tell you any of that. And there's this withholding of himself, maybe from Shane in some ways, and this withholding relationship that he had with his dad. I think we get a story of a guy who's just sort of like nebulous and hard to pin down, and he's not forthcoming with the truth or with what's really going on. And even he openly says, I don't really know who I am.
It seemed to me like the commonality. I think it would be fascinating if we had the access to the entire interviews that were conducted with Vince McMahon. But it would seem from what we saw in the edit was the most you would get in terms of cracking the veneer of Vince McMahon was when he would just instantly be challenged or pushed back on. Like he was in one part of like the family and how they were presented on camera. It's like we're characters. Everyone understands that. Well, actually, Shane didn't really like some of the stuff with Linda. Oh, Shane, well, he's a lot more conservative than us. Like you would just get little nuggets like that. And I found Shane's role in this to be very interesting. I thought he was someone that you could take a lot from just the reactions and seeing how he was answering questions and little comments here and there from Vince McMahon that it told me a lot about that dynamic between the two that I think everyone has, seen hints of, but this was the most visual that you can see this relationship demonstrated in this 6-episode series.
I think the most interesting story in which this documentary, and nothing has really ever told, and I think it's still unfolding, is what is this family like? You get allegations from Janelle Grant saying in her complaint that Linda and Vince are not together anymore. I think there's obvious questions to ask about what was going through Stephanie's mind in 2022 and why she later left in early 2023. I think she would have a different perspective than she does at times in this documentary. And what is the relationship with Shane like? We got the most insight to, but I think he comes off as kind of a lonely person. And if his family is not communicating that well these days, and is not, maybe what it used to be, I think that only intensifies that. And you get, this guy who's withholding information, and it makes you wonder about how well they're communicating, and if he's ever going to tell these stories, not just the stories about his family and how that unfolded and how that relates to WWE, but other stories about wrestling history that he's alluding to that he doesn't want to tell. I mean, he's 79 years old, and I'm starting to wonder if he's ever going to tell his side of history, which in some ways he is complaining about not being able to tell in this statement that he released on Tuesday night earlier this week.
All right, we are going to be bringing in our guest in just one moment, but there's only one way to introduce him, and that's with the unofficial narrator of the Mr. McMahon series.
The Shakespearean tragedy of this tale is that the great success that has been enjoyed by Vincent Kennedy McMahon was driven by the overcompensatory behavior, rebelling against the first miserable 12 years of his life. And escaping that abuse has been his life pursuit in creating an atmosphere in which he is untouchable and invulnerable to outside forces and in control of his own destiny.
And now we are joined, the co-host of Between the Sheets, David Bixenspan, joining us here on Pollock and Thurston as when Paul Heyman brings us into this. Hello, Dave. How are you?
Hi, Bix.
That was one of the most Heyman things that ever Heymaned.
Heyman was at another level at times in this documentary. Like, it was pretty over the top, and maybe somewhat of that has been swayed by yourself, Bix, in my psyche. But there was a like Heyman was, I mean, utilizing every moment that he had on camera for his sound bites. It's a very loaded question, Bix, but assuming you have gone through all 6 episodes by now, let us start off with what you felt were the strengths of the series, and then we will talk about all things in between.
I would say biggest strength overall is the archival. There was stuff in there that, I mean, some stuff I couldn't believe they had, some that I figured they probably had, but was amazed it got included. Like the clip of Vince shooting the drug-free sports entertainment speech. And then
in high def.
Well, no. They're just very good at up-converting everything. Okay. But you think you're just watching the aired version, and then it turns out we're watching the raw footage, and after Vince is done with the speech, he just makes this face like, eh.
That was quite something. Lifting that footage of Ted Turner watching the Billionaire Ted skits, I mean, that to me was...
yes, from presumably his deposition from the WCW trademark lawsuit. Yeah.
In terms of just, like, least amount of screen time, but value to what she had, like, Kay Koplovitz, like, the 2 times she's on this thing, it's like talking about, if Vince had been found guilty, he's off the air at USA, giving her own thoughts into the relationship of Vince and Shane. And a third one was them putting the kibosh on the Billionaire Ted skits as well. Like she was there for probably a grand total of 90 seconds, but I thought every time she showed up, it was something insightful.
Yeah, I thought she and Bonnie Hammer were both very good and very good additions that brought something much different from the rest of the talking heads, even if their screen time was fairly limited. Was Koplovitz the one who brought up wanting to kibosh the billionaire Ted skits after the comments about Turner's lithium
I think
use?
so. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, which I'm glad they acknowledged it, but the full context is worse than was even said there. Like, for those who don't know, Ted Turner, I mean, he's still alive, he has dementia, but he has bipolar disorder. And he was very open about this and taking lithium for bipolar disorder. Not only did the billionaire Ted skits and then later Vince in interviews like on Conan O'Brien make light of it, like he tried to somehow make it seem like Ted Turner taking lithium was a drug problem.
Well, doesn't he say isn't he quoted in the Grant complaint as saying, they're talking about therapy, like talk therapy, and he says therapy my ass or something like that, which indicates that, he looks.
Yeah, well, yes. But yeah, I thought them as talking heads was good. I do think it probably could have benefited from more of those like non-wrestling types, like a Dick Ebersol or someone like that too. But I thought they added to it, the archival. The one thing I couldn't believe was in there that they had raw footage of like a 1976 TV taping with the off-air chatter from Vince, and him and his dad like starting the show and stuff. Like that was something that was very out of nowhere. So I think that's one of the strong suits. They do cover in some form basically every controversy that you would hope they do. But it's how they cover it that becomes the problem, and I think is probably going to be the thing we talk about most here is, sure, you talk about the Ring Boy scandal, and honestly, in some ways went further than I expected, especially with how Pat Patterson was mixed into it. Mm-hmm. But then also they keep showing over and over that, infamous, Phil Mushnick column that was on the cover of the sports page of the New York Post, Sex Lies in the WWF. They keep showing it over and over again. At no point do they mention what's in it, which is Phil Mushnick talking about how Vince McMahon admitted to him and Dave Meltzer that he had fired Mel Phillips a few years earlier, suspecting he was a pedophile, and then hired him back if he stayed away from kids. So
that was such a key detail, Bix, that as I'm watching this and you've got the two reporters that this was told to on the record, that to me is a smoking gun right there that you would have wished could have given better context here. And it almost is as though this is like it's not like spelled out this way, but I mean, for a lot of fans that are watching this, that have just been brought up on this idea that Phil Mushnick was this guy with this agenda against WWF and just had this hatred for the company. Like that is almost what this is reduced to for some. And I don't know if this did enough to kind of dispel that if you're going into that without any kind of knowledge of this story and the fact that this is what precipitated all the steroid distribution charges that would come.
Yeah. And, with Phil Mushnick, and look, we should say, like, Phil Mushnick is a very flawed person, and outside of the WWE stuff, doesn't come off that great a lot of the time. But in this context, he's usually in the right. And by not giving details like that, you're showing him being firm that Vince knew about the Ring Boy abuse. You're not explaining why he thinks that. And, I appreciated that they include like an exasperated Phil Mushnick even just yelling out, "It was a pedophile ring." Like that again is something more impactful than I expected. But to me, if you're doing something like showing that article and not talking about what's in it, especially when you're interviewing both Mushnick and Meltzer, it comes off like they're trying to talk out of both sides of their mouth. And the other thing that really jumped out at me that way, well, there are two. There are two more things that jumped out at me that way. One is the Owen Hart coverage of his death, where they basically sidestepped any of the
I thought, Bix, of all the scandals, I thought the Owen Hart one was the one that they really did miss the boat on and just gave, like, it just, I can absolve, like, if you're not going to go all in depth on Montreal, but the Owen Hart stuff to me was just, like, the whole idea of just like it's common knowledge essentially that the company was warned in advance by their previous rigor. Like this is too dangerous to do at this, and they were going to go find a cheaper rigger for this. Like, you cannot just say that this was not something that there was there was just poor practices put into place for this entire stunt, and I felt that was one that needed a lot more detail attached to it, because it just did not give a proper context of that tragedy.
No, it didn't. And not only that they went to a cheaper rigger who would use a quick release to make it easier for Owen to get out of the rigging. You look at the police reports and stuff. When the Kansas City Police Department talked to Bobby Talbert, the rigger, he says explicitly they told him, we need a new rigger because the other one was too slow for the TV cameras. Like, it's very clear what was going on, and you look at the police report and also the stuff that's in Martha Hart's book that comes from the lawsuit. Steve Taylor was the one handling all that, and it was at Vince McMahon's direct orders. Like, this isn't even just a broader WWE thing. Vince was directly involved. Vince was directly negligent. Yeah. And to just completely sidestep all that and reduce it down to, oh, well, the shackle was defective, which it wasn't defective. It worked the way it was supposed to. It's just that they continued marketing or selling it to stunt companies knowing that it was being misused. It was not defective. It worked the way it was supposed to. It, released at the load it was supposed to. The problem was it just should not have been used in the way it was, and they knew it was still being used in that way. That's why WWE was able to sue the shackle company and recoup a lot of the settlement money.
One thing that stood out to me about the Owen Hart segment was having listened to John's audio documentary about Owen Hart, and where you have Jeff Merrick on, and he says that he should have armed Michael Landsberg with the question, what would you have done if it was your son, if it was Shane who had fallen? And he actually answers that question in this documentary and basically says, yes, if it was Shane, we would have still continued the show. If it was me, I would have wanted the show to continue.
And also, go ahead. Just one other thing, and this has kind of just become urban legend, and I think it's one that people have just assumed over the years, and they focus on it subtly in the documentary, is that, like, the blood on the canvas is not Owen Hart's blood.
Well, no, that's not necessarily the case.
I think, where they're showing that, that's clearly from the brood spot.
Well, so here's the thing. The police report says that there was human blood mixed in with that.
At that portion of the ring, though?
Yes. It was taken from that stain. So,
because what they're showing in the documentary, it's verbatim, where you have the Hardys taking this bloodbath on Sunday Night Heat.
Yes.
And anyway, not to say but anyway, go on.
It's more complicated. The point is, we don't know for sure. It's not an unreasonable belief to think that his blood was in there, I guess is the way to put it. Is most of the visible stain probably from the brood angle? Yes.
Is this what we're talking about here, what I've just put on the screen?
Yes.
Okay.
But I mean, you can see from the picture that is where Owen fell. You can tell from the way the ring is buckled that it is still the correct corner. So
it's right near the corner. It's like that is the spot where this happens on Sunday Night Heat. I'm fairly certain what is circled here is not blood. But nonetheless.
But they tested it. There was nothing about DNA testing.
No.
So would it be other blood from that night? Because I think someone got hard-weighed from a guitar shot and stuff. Yes. But there was actual blood in there, and it is the correct part of the ring. So it's possible. And even then, you can say, wrestling with his blood on the mat can be figurative just as easily as it is literal in this scenario.
Without getting into the weeds as well, and this is again what Jeff Merrick brings up in the doc is this is a crime scene. This should not have been Vince McMahon's call to make. This should have been sorry, this is no longer your arena for the night.
Yes.
It is taken over. This is a murder, not a this is a potential.
Because you don't know.
You don't know what's happened. This is just right as this has happened. A man has died in your ring. This is a crime scene. Case closed. That's it.
And
but that was not that. Like that should not have even been Vince McMahon's choice to make.
No, he made a bad choice, but it shouldn't have been his choice. And on top of that, it was bullshit clearly. But you look through the police report; they did talk to a fan who said they saw someone push Owen Hart. So, like on that night, they at least have the possibility that's a murder, and yet they didn't shut it down.
Mm-hmm. In terms of we can like kind of go all over here, but who were some of the key voices that you felt were missing, Bix, that you would have wanted to hear from personally, or did you feel there was a good representation of where they were mainly covering?
I mean, just in general, Jim Ross is the obvious one, that we've been talking about all week after what he said that he wasn't even contacted. I think the most glaring thing, or one of the most glaring things about the whole docuseries, which, Garrett Martin pointed out in his Pace Magazine review, the only women who we hear from who worked for Vince and are not family members are Wendy Richter and Trish Stratus.
Yeah.
Like, there are no other women who worked for Vince that aren't a McMahon in that whole 6-hour docuseries. And to me, especially knowing this stuff was shot before, the Wall Street Journal stories, like, that's very telling to me. Whether it's on the side of no one wanting to do the interviews or on the side of them not wanting to seek out the interviews for whatever reason.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a general sense that I think is indicated from Jimmy Hart's one soundbite where you guys talked about it last night, John and Way, was that he starts to talk about something and he says, well, I don't know how much they want out there, which I believe is indicative of, it's symbolic of probably a wider sentiment. Maybe when it comes to these sort of talking head pieces in general, that people know that there's a certain line that you're not supposed to cross and you're supposed to play a certain game to protect WWE and Vince.
And also, when these interviews are being done, it is a WWE project.
Mm-hmm.
There is that, too. They are a co-producer at the time most of these interviews are done. I mean, it could be all the interviews, because, like, did you find out when you did the reporting about finding out that the WWE production credit wasn't there anymore? Did you find out what point they pulled out?
No, we're talking about, we confirmed that there was no production credit on screen.
Yes.
And we also confirmed from a source that we don't know about the timing.
Yeah, but that's a factor too. Like, I can tell you personally, like, I talked to someone a while back that, was hesitant to do it because it was a WWE project. So I think that's a factor. I think there was also, I can just tell you, like, I think there were people, for sure. There were people who did not trust this project to be what they were telling everyone it was because WWE was officially involved. So I think that's absolutely a factor in that. And especially, again, it is glaring that this is basically all men and corporate and a few corporate women.
Yeah, and we can't speak to the reason, but Janelle Grant was approached to participate in this, but did not for whatever reason.
Yeah. Yes. So yeah, I would say that, like, as far as talking heads, and then, you know what? Dick Ebersol, like I said earlier, feels like a big omission. Makes you honestly wonder where their relationship is at after all the XFL, AAF stuff from a few years ago. That someone like that, who was very important to Vince's professional life and was a legitimate social friend of his for so long, isn't in this. So he's someone else. Look, we don't really get, like, insight from, like, people who were on the inside, like, building the company with him for the most part. Like, we really don't. And it's the type of thing you would expect that's just not there. And that's one of the biggest complaints I've seen from people about this. Like, especially if you want to show this to people who aren't really wrestling fans, there's not that much substance beyond this happened and then this happened and then this happened a lot of the time.
Yeah, the name Bob McMullen, who was just featured in that book, The Six Pack, that Brad Baluchian put out. Like, that would be a fascinating guy to hear from in terms of the expansion years and coming in as an accountant for the company. But it kind of just goes against this narrative that this was Vince McMahon's creation and everything that came out of that expansion period was from Vince McMahon's mind. And again, I think that is a problem in that you're trying to cover everything and you have to sacrifice depth in order to check off the boxes of all these things that they're covering. But I think there's a lot of people that were looking for more than just, a chronology. And like, I'm watching one instance of Trish Stratus, and you're getting this theme of how everyone works under Vince McMahon, and Tony Atlas outlining that, I'm a lot more disposable than a Pat Patterson. And my question to Trish Stratus would have been, if you had an objection to this angle, are you in a position to say no? What would be the consequences of you saying no? Because we have a pattern of these women involved in sexualized angles with Vince McMahon. Are they really in a position to turn down these types of degrading storylines? Because that paints quite the picture of what the culture was in this company.
Yeah, and beyond, the bark like a dog angle, which everyone is focusing on her reaction to that and to the degree to which she was kind of rolling her eyes at even the idea of talking about it. To me, the most telling thing from her interviews along those lines was when she says that Vince had proposed something where she doesn't say the name, but based on how it's arranged in the footage and everything, she's clearly talking about Mickie James, that there was supposed to be some angle Vince proposed where she would, in her words, make out with another woman, presumably Mickie. And she turned it down, and she outright said, and then I lost the title the next week. Was it a punishment? I don't know. And it's just left there. There is no reflection on the fact that, yeah, you can kind of classify that as sexual harassment on some level. It's just left there. That's it. There is no reflection on it. Nothing. And look, I'll put it this way. Watching it, I really got the feeling that we know it started in a different place than it ended up, but it really felt like the middle episodes were not retooled the way they should have been, and that the main retooling went in the first and last episode. Because, you have the knowledge of the larger context of this, and you just let that sit there.
What are you looking for? Get Vince's response to that?
Or just even in the even get a talking head from someone else if you're not even if you blew the opportunity in the interview with Trish, that you're not doing anything to thread that needle, basically.
How did you feel about the overall contributions of Tony Atlas? And I mean, he has, he puts out an allegation regarding Pat Patterson, and I mean, they lean on him a lot in this. I mean, he has, when you speak about comments that kind of don't get any follow-up, I mean, just stating how they just abused women like they were toys. I mean, that's, I don't know, just an average person watching this, that's a pretty damning line that you're hearing, and it's just kind of said and not revisited.
Yeah, I mean, he came off remorseful at least, but yeah, he says that, and again, it's just kind of left there. And I did think, though, he honestly came off better than most people in the documentary. Because he was very blunt, he seemed fairly reflective, he explained things well, and he didn't seem to be hiding anything. I thought he came off very well. I thought he was actually one of the more valuable talking heads overall, which is not something I would have expected going in. He is a guy who I think has long been kind of underestimated for various reasons, whether it's racism in general or the different aspects of his public persona, and some of these are intertwined, how his babyface character at points was kind of framed as this kind of friendly simpleton. And then, the way the foot fetish stuff has kind of dominated his, pun not intended, his public persona in more recent years. I think it leads people to take him less seriously than they should. And I'm not saying he's 100% honest or shouldn't be looked at the same way other wrestlers are in terms of trying to figure out if there's an angle to what they're saying. But I felt like overall he came off credible, and like you read interviews and listen to him in serious settings in the past, like about, Bruiser Brody's murder, or in Brad Beluccian's book where he's talking about, trying to avoid, like, what was it, like sexual abuse in group homes and stuff like that. He is a pretty smart, thoughtful guy, and I think you saw that side of him here.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm looking too deep into this, but to me, Tony Atlas was kind of like this microcosm that is representative of a lot of these stories we talk about that outside of wrestling can easily be dismissed and laughed off, but at its core, there's a real message there, and something that the way it is delivered, it can be like Tony Atlas can just be people's punchline, because they're not going to go beyond the surface level of just what this guy is wearing for this interview, as an example. But you get past that at the message that he is sharing. And this is someone that, I felt that he was trying to explain, like, listen, this is an industry that does not conform to the norms of society. Like, this is not how things work in this company. And he's explaining that with the Pat Patterson allegation, and like just literally laughing off the notion of like having any kind of, going up the chain to report an indiscretion.
Yes. And I'm glad too that they, specifically had him saying, who am I going to go to? Pat's the booker. Because I think that's a thing that even like in 92, that was a thing people understood. I think people have lost sight of in time that whether he officially was or wasn't, because, Vince is always the head booker, blah, blah, blah. The wrestlers looked at Pat Patterson as the booker, in that era. So he was not, quote unquote, just a road agent. Like he was, and he wasn't, just an office grunt in talent relations or whatever. Like he was a, very direct, very powerful superior to them. And like, we shouldn't lose sight of that. That like, yeah, they saw him as the booker. They see, you got to think of this the same as if it was, Dusty Rhodes or someone like that pulling the same stuff. And I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Did you come out of this with any different thoughts on the Vince-Shane dynamic? Because that's focused on quite a bit once we get to the 5th episode. And by the end of it, I think it's an interesting link that you have of Vince with his father to Vince and Shane. And I found Shane to be like quite an interesting aspect to this, where I felt he was pretty forthright, wasn't going to just spell it out for you, the viewer, but I think you were left with drawing your own conclusion about a fractured relationship.
I think it kind of confirmed everything we'd ever thought and heard, really. I mean, the story Eamon tells about
nuts.
Vince, I don't know if you could say facetiously or whatever, like telling Shane to knife him with a steak knife if he wanted to take over the company. Yeah, was insane.
Bix, let's hear the story from the orator himself.
The most definitive moment I've ever seen between Vince and Shane was a creative argument that happened one night. Shane had an idea that he really believed in, and Vince totally disagreed with it. And with most things that happen with Vince, once they start to escalate, they escalate really fast. And Vince finally turned to Shane and he said, "Not while I'm alive." And Vince, who was eating something, took his knife and handed it to Shane. And he says, "Right there. Come on. Right there. If you want this so bad, stick the dagger right here. Because that's what you're going to have to do to make that decision. And if you don't stick the dagger right here, then I'll know you're not man enough to do it. And I have to take that into consideration as well. Or you can buy me out the way I bought out my father. And if I don't get out of your way, be prepared to get rid of me the way I would have had to get rid of my father when he wasn't doing things my way at all.
Was Paul's mother ironing the laundry at the same time this was going on?
Well, remember, that wasn't Paul's house. That was Ron Buffon's house. That was Ron Buffon's mother.
Thank you, Bix.
So Heyman is just so over the top at some points where it's just like he's full on promo mode in some of these, like I can't discount this story from occurring. It's wild enough that I could believe this story, or it could be.
Yeah, he doesn't place it in time, right? Supposedly there was some sort of dispute, Royal Rumble 2023 or 2022 that led to some falling out.
But I mean, I think that brings us to, though, Heyman's role in the documentary, in how, and this is not super obvious if you don't have the subtitles on.
Yeah.
When they're talking about Sable.
Yeah, I missed it the first time and did not even, like, they actually do subtitle that this is Heyman essentially coaching Vince off camera, and since, like, Bill Simmons and David Shoemaker have talked about the fact, like, Vince, for all these interviews, he showed up with a team that was essentially there to be, I guess, his safety net.
Yes, and I find it very interesting that Heyman was in that role, and then you kind of think about that alongside him telling a story like that, when it seems pretty clear from him being in that role that he is explicitly in the inner circle, by that point. It makes you wonder a lot of things, and like I feel like that is not a story he would tell unless it was a story Vince wanted it out, as far as the Shane thing. So make of that what you'd like, but then also, like, look, obviously we have to talk very delicately about this, but like the fact that they even showed that part about the Sable stuff and emphasized that Heyman was coaching him when they were like, oh yeah, and then he brought Sable back and he started a relationship with her. And Vince is like, what? And Heyman off camera is like, storyline. And I felt like they put that in there for people to draw conclusions from. And
Vince didn't have a poker face either when.
No. That was kind of shocking. And it's this documentary so all over the place, because on one hand they're protecting Vince in some areas and then they're doing that. It's just such a weird piece of work.
How did you feel they were protecting him?
The Owen Hart stuff, the Montreal giving the Vince version.
It was a very Vince version of Montreal in terms of Brett's willingness to lose was not thoroughly explored.
Yes, and like the Ring Boy thing I mentioned earlier in the Phil Mushnick article, where it's like, we know you know this. You keep showing the article, so we know you know this. And it's like it felt all over the place. Like it really felt like them trying to, I don't know if make the best of something that started as a WWE production turned into not being one or what, but I should add too, I'm not convinced WWE wasn't still involved with this production at the end and just didn't take the credit. Because that's something else about the subtitles. If you watch this with subtitles on, every time
I saw this and I thought, Bix is going to point this out. Go ahead.
World Wrestling Entertainment. Even
every time someone says World Wrestling Federation, it says World Wrestling Entertainment. And I'm sorry, no rational human being that does not work for that company would do that.
And then I thought, well, if they're getting the footage from WWE, maybe the captioning just comes with the footage that they're using.
No, this was captioning that was done for the thing. Like, I mean, like, that was something else that like jumped out.
But is it captioning of their new interviews for this documentary that say World Wrestling Entertainment when someone is actually saying World Wrestling Federation? I noticed it mainly when it was archival footage.
No, but it was archival footage that included non-WWE footage too, like news footage and stuff. So that, and also like something else that jumped out at me in the captions just separately, they would default to using the Talking Head's real name. like they show the real name and the stage name alongside each other, but like whenever it's Tony Atlas is talking off screen, it's always White for Anthony White. Yeah, Trish Stratus is always Strategius, which I just found weird. But yeah, it's like I'm sorry, I don't see that as being a thing that that was not produced by WWE, that anyone would do that. Oh, and then we got away from this earlier. The other thing that really jumped out at me is like feeling like it was trying to protect someone or whatever is when they get into the Janelle Grant lawsuit. If you concentrate hard and look at them showing the complaint, you see WWE and John Laurinaitis are defendants, but it's not mentioned. WWE being a defendant is not mentioned. John Laurinaitis' name and existence is never mentioned. And it just feels like kind of what everyone expected. Oh, that maybe they don't explicitly go in this direction, but this is the reason Netflix is putting it out now is so they can get the bad man gone narrative across.
I think at the end of the 6 episodes, whether it's like, I don't know how you don't come to that conclusion that if you're just watching this, it's like the problem is gone. The problem is not the company. The problem is the person that was leading the company. I think I was talking to Brandon about this at the beginning of the show. I think if you're WWE, I don't think you're that upset with this. I think this just says everything out loud that this company has been distancing itself from all year long.
And let's explore like why. What are the issues still that W has not answered for in terms of, well, for one thing, in the complaint, there are 4 anonymized corporate officers. We know one of them is Nick Khan, who's still the current top executive in the company. They haven't been very forthcoming with what the changes are that they have made to policies. We had to get one of the policies that are available to employees and publish it ourselves. And Paul Levesque has not handled questions related to this issue well at all. Maybe you want to list some others.
Maybe also with the policy changes and stuff beyond, the general, I forget what the official wording they used was, but besides the fraternization policy that you guys got, remember Shawn Michaels said on a media call that there were changes made I think specifically at the NXT level in 2022, and he promised to get them to the reporters on the call and then never did. So there was also that. I'm trying to figure out where we were before we got it. But it as far as, things that are lacking in their response, I mean, there are things that are just still big question marks to me. Like, you have NXT with this heavy emphasis on signing younger women these days, and there's no full-time female coach. Sarah Amato has not been working full-time there since her maternity leave, 2+ years ago. She's there a few hours a week. I'm not saying that as a slight to her, but, Allison Danger was fired under, when she was brought in basically to take that role a few months after she got there under very curious circumstances. And there's never been another female coach hired since. Serena Deeb and Sarah Stock had been there before the pandemic layoffs. And, Deep got signed as a wrestler by AEW pretty quickly. So, okay, I get why they didn't bring her back. Sarah Stock was just out in the wilderness until AEW hired her as a producer. So, like, you ask yourself the question, especially with so many young women there who really could use, for a number of different reasons, a female coach, why is that role not being filled? And why does it seem like it's deliberately not being filled?
In terms of kind of just looking at the overall rollout of this documentary, like this comes at a time like WWE was not going to promote this. And really in the lead up to this, like I didn't see Chris Smith or Bill Simmons out promoting this at all beyond like Bill Simmons, like a mention on his podcast. It's not like there was like this slew of like reviews in advance of this. It just felt as though, well, we're at the finish line. We need to just get this thing out. Was this the time to put this documentary out? And what did you just think about the way Netflix ended up handling this thing that has gone on for years at this point, and this being the time they felt was right to put this out, and maybe wanting to just get this out before the Raw deal goes into effect?
I think that's definitely part of it, and just deciding, okay, like, it's as done as it's going to be. If it's mainly formatted in a way that does not reflect badly on the current leadership, what's the harm? Like, I think that was definitely part of it. You know, the whole promotional strategy or lack thereof, I find very interesting. Like, normally, Netflix or any of the major streamers do a big, like, docuseries rollout. You get all sorts of interviews with the directors and executive producers. And we had none here. You know, we had Simmons doing his podcast with Shoemaker when it came out this week, but that was it. And there's that. There's, you know, the very small amount of reviews, which I felt like was probably just that most critics weren't actually interested in it. That, you know, you didn't have any of the major TV critics covering this at all. And I don't say that as a slight to the people who covered it, but I mean, it was fairly obvious from who covered it and reviewed it in advance that it was basically all wrestling fans, you know, like Garrett. And I'm not sure what I make of that. Like, the fact that it seemed there was like zero buy-in on this from the larger, you know, community of TV critics. I mean, maybe it wasn't even offered to them. You know, who knows? Like, and then also, I find it very interesting that it seems like, for the most part, they deliberately excluded wrestling media from getting screeners. You know, all of us tried to get screeners and were ignored. It seems like Dave Meltzer got some kind of screener, but had a different embargo from everyone else. It was a little confusing. But he also didn't get it until the last minute. I think he and Wrestling Inc. are the only ones I know that got advanced screeners. And, you know, with Wrestling Inc., it's entirely, and I should note, you know, I don't write for Wrestling Inc. anymore, but I do still work for Static Media. So I feel like that needs to be a caveat, but like, they probably got it because they also had, you know, other sites like Slash Film and stuff that, you know, were affiliated that were getting screeners. So it feels like there was some kind of deliberate strategy here. I'm just not sure exactly what it was, but it certainly doesn't seem like it was to get maximum publicity at all.
Yeah, I imagine this is a production that they've sunk a lot of money into, and they've had to you know, make changes at various times when they probably thought they were going to release this years ago. And I'm sure Netflix wants to get their money's worth out of this and just get it released, get it put to use in some form. But there is this conflict of this is going to be WWE's biggest business partner come the new year.
Yeah, you just compare this to when they put out that Undertaker series, and my God, there wasn't a show on earth that I don't think that guy did promoting that release. And it's funny because last night I was asking Way about, you know, the idea of WWE wanting to go this route again with some kind of documentary series. And after listening to Bill Simmons and David Shoemaker, my question would be, I don't know if Bill Simmons maybe wants to go through this all again. That's me just like guessing here, but like just from his tone, it sounded like this was a very, very frustrating project to go through. And by the end of it, yeah, I would just be curious if they would want another go around doing a series like this on a WWE figure of some note.
Yeah, and also, I mean, something we should mention too is that it's just kind of fascinating about this whole thing is that whether WWE did or didn't, you know, quote unquote, officially pull out by the end, it still stands in contrast from the previous similar project they had signed on to that just kind of vanished into the ether, which was the Craig Marks, Rob Tannenbaum oral history book.
Yeah,
that was supposed to be very, you know, similar concept. WWE is cooperating. They do not have any edit control, but they say they're giving full cooperation, and that project just kind of disappeared.
What do you make, Bix, of where obviously the Wall Street Journal reporting, I think, is your demarcation line. But when this documentary was first announced, like all these allegations previously were known about when it comes to Rita Chatterton or the Ring Boy scandal. But it was almost like Vince was Teflon from this. And it's like, I go back to that Angry Vince tweets, Twitter account. It's like that was so many people's perception. Like Vince McMahon is this wild, cartoonish character. And it felt like that's what they felt they were getting into. This crazy over the top character that this was going to be fun. And it was like, now that veneer is gone. And it would seem that like there's so much that is out there, and yet Vince McMahon just seemed averse to any of that baggage until the past 2 years.
And just to itemize, but by 2006, you know about the Boca Raton allegation, you know about Rhea Chatterton, and you know about his overseeing of the Ring Boy scandal.
Yes, and also the other casting couch type stuff and harassment stuff of the talent alongside the Ring Boy scandal too. So it's. I mean, look, we've talked about this before when you've had me on about some of these subjects. Unfortunately, there's always been it's just wrestling. Oh, it's fake wrestling. The most telling example is always at the end of the Donahue episode, where you have this woman who's been sitting in the audience for an hour listening to all these stories of sexual harassment and whatnot, and then just says, I don't get it, isn't wrestling fake anyway? Like, that always governs all this, unfortunately. And I think it's stuck to him now for a few reasons. The first is Wall Street Journal lucked into the story having the corporate governance aspect that made it click for their editors, and to make it a Wall Street Journal story with the hush money payments and them not being reported properly, which, by the way, something that has kind of gone unnoticed since January that no one really talks about. They don't outright say it, but the Janelle Grant lawsuit makes it pretty clear that the money came from WWE and not Vince McMahon. And no one's really acknowledged that the account they say it came from is labeled as a WWE account on the wire transfer.
I think we've talked about this. So how are you driving that?
They gave the wire transfer information, and it was explicitly
Who's they? When?
Ann Callis in the complaint.
Okay.
And the wire transfer information was pretty explicit that it was a WWE corporate account. So, I don't know what I make of that, but like it's still, it ties into the same thing. You've got the corporate governance issues that made it a Wall Street Journal story for them to jump on. And then, with the Janelle Grant lawsuit, it was a lawsuit that was clearly designed, and I do not mean this in a negative way, and I hope no one takes it that way. It was a lawsuit where the complaint was designed to get maximum media coverage.
And where the money comes from, how does that matter much? Like whether the money came out of Vince's personal account or WWE's business accounts, ultimately the money was used to protect not only Vince but also the company, and therefore that money had to be accounted for under WWE's financial reporting. It
had to be accounted for regardless, but they've accounted for it as Vince making the payments on behalf of the company, not the company making the payments.
And so the issue is that Vince has said, or WWE has said at some point, either Vince or McDivitt or whomever has said that, this was money that came out of Vince's personal accounts.
Yes, and you go by what's in that complaint, it doesn't really seem like that's the case. It was an old enough account that it said World Wrestling Federation, but it's clearly marked as being a corporate account. I remember when the lawsuit was filed, I did reach out to Ann Callis' PR person that, emailed everyone to ask, like, are you saying WWE corporate paid the money? And no one responded.
And this is in the original complaint of January 20th, because I've just Controlled F for Wired, and it has the old headquarters address here. It does say WWF, so this is what you're referring to, this WWF here, care of.
Yeah, if it's care of WWF and with the Titan Towers address, like, am I missing something here? Like, I really don't think I am.
Yeah,
but
that lines up, I suppose. Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, like, yes, those are the reasons, and that and also not in the complete like specifics. I won't get into all the gross stuff, but like that you have the text messages, and that Vince has not denied that the text messages are real, and honestly has not even really tried to claim they were even out of context that much. So I think it's all of that is what's really made this stick. And then also that TKO was able to just kick him out because he doesn't have the special voting chairs anymore.
As we begin to wind this down, I just want to go back when you were mentioning, speaking with someone who had their hesitancy about being involved in this because of the involvement of WWE. Do you have the sense that it's because their interview might not be contextualized properly, or was it just a fear of repercussions about speaking up about Vince McMahon? Like, my question being, if there were, a more distanced documentary when it comes to this story that does not have WWE and any of its fingerprints, that that would have eased that person's concern.
Without giving specifics, so no one in the production can figure out who I'm talking about, both.
Okay. Because I do feel like there is still the concern about speaking up about Vince McMahon, even in his current diminished power. But at the same time, like, I can certainly see a lot of hesitancy when this was first announced as WWE Studios being involved. And would you want to necessarily tell your story in this forum as opposed to one that has more of a distance from WWE than the streaming giant that's, just invested billions over the next 2 decades?
Yeah, exactly. I totally get the hesitance on that end. Like, I
do too.
Yeah, like, you're putting this in WWE's hands, and that's just, no matter what you're being told, and WWE won't actually control it, whatever. Like, if you've dealt with that company, how are you supposed to believe that?
I mean, I would say, in WWE's view, you can't say his name on the air, and so you can't disparage him. You're supposed to forget that he's there. He's the Chris Benoit of the 2020s, and so I would view, if I were talent, that that even if you're outside of the company, it's you're taking a little bit of a risk to talk about him in any capacity, I would say, because it's such a sensitive issue that may lead people to remember his association with the company and any responsibilities that WWE may have related to that.
Yes, and also I think it's become clear in the last few months, it seems like a lot of wrestlers, especially retired wrestlers, aren't convinced that he's actually gone.
Well, then some of them don't believe in CTE either.
Yes, but I mean, like, Mark Henry, like, whether it's his genuine opinion, he's doing it because he thinks Vince might not be gone, or he thinks WWE might like it, which is probably wrong, or a combination of the three. Like, I don't, like, you hear the Mark Henry comments. I don't think that guy thinks Vince is never coming back.
No, I think Mark Henry is probably one person of a lot of people who's actually said what other people are probably also thinking, and yes. we're alluding to his doubts of Janelle Grant's accusations.
Yes, the only people we've really heard from, of prominence that have expressed that, even though clearly there are more, are Mark Henry, Ron Killings, with the Instagram comments on the personal trainer's post. I feel like I'm forgetting someone. I mean, you could say John Cena, kind of, but not exactly.
I would say we see this generally about where somebody has a close personal relationship with someone, they find it hard to believe that person who they had a nice experience with was, and he's portrayed, I think, accurately as this father figure to so many. It's hard for those people to reconcile that this person might have actually done something really terrible.
You say that like I didn't argue that on Twitter with people who had friends who may have done something terribly.
I try not to read Twitter too much, especially Bix's timeline. So the replies anyway. But I think these are like, I think I told you this like in response to when we were sharing the Mark Henry clip. Like, these are men grieving who are trying to reconcile these horrible allegations, not just from one person, but from 6 or 7 people over the course of many years. And they're trying to reconcile their father-like experience in relationship with this person with these descriptions of terrible sexual assault scenes.
Yeah, and honestly, we should also be a little fair too, in that they are trying to deal. Like, look, Jim Ross, I have a lot of empathy for in trying to navigate this, because that is someone that Vince McMahon was clearly, not in the same way he was necessarily allegedly abusive to women, but Vince was still very abusive emotionally and in other ways to Jim Ross, So I understand that he has a lot of stuff to deal with this. And you know what? With even Mark Henry and other wrestlers, I would say especially black wrestlers who have been through that company, and especially like Mark Henry, if they've been in sexualized storylines, there's a lot of stuff in that lawsuit that suddenly makes you reconsider a lot of things that happen. So I could certainly see why someone in that position would then end up in, whether it's denial or whatever about that. You know, like I'll just say it, on Between the Sheets lately, since the lawsuit was filed in January, when we do a show from like 1999 through the 2000s, it feels like every week there is some kind of insane, sexualized, and sometimes racialized storyline that it's clearly from the deepest recesses of Vince's brain, and often multiple per week. So anyone who got mixed up in that, I can see why now, seeing the allegations about how that intertwined with his personal life, I can see how that would be very difficult to deal with. And I do empathize with that to a degree.
And it's not in a vacuum either. Like, this was, I think everyone kind of understood what Vince McMahon was looking for, and that permeated a writer's staff and those around him, that this all just became the norm. Like that, and for years, you're just writing this content with that direction in mind. And that is a big period of WWE, of, especially like 20 years ago, when I think it was kind of at its worst. But like this, like that kind of gives you a glimpse into this culture where you do have people that look back at some of this stuff and they don't bat an eye, because it was the norm for them every week to just be appealing to this lowest common denominator of representation of women, or stereotypes, or, pick from your drop-down menu. And that was on display every week as you guys go through.
And they try to, in this documentary, sort of explain it away in the context of, for one thing, Vince, they bring up a lot of the xenophobia of different characters. So that I think that, that aligns with the issues around racism and sexism there too. About, he sort of explains it away as moral relativism, that you can't apply the values of today to the values of a different time, and things like, whatever terrible things that Vince was doing on screen, he was the heel and he got his comeuppance at WrestleMania. And I think this is where wrestling isn't fiction enough to be exonerated in that way. I think wrestling is a little bit realer than fiction. It's this sort of semi-nonfiction, in that Vince McMahon is not playing a character with a different fictionalized name. He's playing Vince McMahon. And it's I can tell you, as a former performer, that there's degrees and gradations of how much you're putting on a gimmick and a character. But it's really easy to blur that. And as you got like Steve Austin saying here, as he has so many other times, that the best characters are when they're just turned up with the volume all the way up. And it's really captivating, I think, as a viewer, when you watch the lines get blurred a little bit, and that gets you pulled into the suspension of disbelief. So I think as a performer, there's always this temptation to almost be passive aggressive, and a temptation into indulgence, and into actually like, doing an angle or saying something in a promo that's really going to cut it too close to the bone. And it's really easy to get into like this sort of passive aggression, not ruthless aggression, but passive aggression type situations where, like, I don't know if what I said in that promo, maybe that actually, like, made somebody feel really bad. And that's like a microcosm onto these, situations that Vince casts himself in with women, for example.
The final
and with
word,
his family, yeah.
The final word can only go to one person before we say goodbye to Bix.
It's not about the last name. It's not about a family legacy. It's about who is best qualified. We live by the law of the jungle. And the lion, who still rules this kingdom, wouldn't have it any other way.
Lion. This man was at just an absurd level at certain points.
Where do you think he got that philosophy, law of the jungle, from? Where do you think he heard that from? Did he come up with that himself? Is that an original ECW original?
I'm sure that was when he was chatting with TNN about advertising rates and such and promotion of their Friday night show. I'm sure he was talking about.
No, I think he got it from the man who says that you want to eat people in a wheelchair, sir.
That's right.
Compensatory.
Yeah.
That was the word of the night.
Those are the types of damages that I seek from the Nashville network in the inevitable lawsuit that I will not file because, as is often the case, I am bluffing because I do not want to spend money on lawyers.
This weekend, I know that you and Chris Zellner are going back to not the passive aggression era of 2006. Will the two of you be discussing this series on your halftime segment?
Chris was not planning on watching it at all, I don't think, so probably not. I will be on Jesse Collins' Gentleman Wrestling podcast to talk about it, though. He invited me on, so I will have more to say on there, and curious what he has to ask and to say as well. Between the Sheets every week, comes out late Sunday night, Monday morning, covering a week in wrestling history, as it was in the newsletters with clips and stuff and analysis. And this coming week can be 2006. I'm trying to remember, what did we do last week? The one that's up now when this comes out. I'm pulling up the website because my brain is fried. 1989, the week after the plastic bag angle. So that's the show that's up right now. And then Patreon show wise, which will be going up in the next day or two at patreon.com/between the sheets, $5 a month tier or higher. Part 2 of our 2-part series on Chris Jericho leaving WCW, going to WWF 25 years ago. And boy, is it interesting looking back at that and Vince's role in that and screaming at Jericho about how he's green as grass and all that, and how that gets relayed in the newsletters and which parts are most similar to Jericho's book and whatnot. So that's coming within the next day or two. And then also next month, our Patreon show will be looking at Vince Russo and Ed Ferrara leaving WWF for WCW. So we're going to stay in the same basic time frame. And there was enough for a whole show just looking at the two of them leaving, not even getting into Russo's booking. I mean, Russo did a long torch talk with Wade Keller that I had forgotten about for his departure. So we have that. We also have the interview that Russo gave to Ben Miller, the man that is never right, for WrestleLine days before he left, with the infamous comment about not wanting to see Mexican or Japanese wrestlers. So that's going to be in there too. So that's coming as October's Patreon show at patreon.com/between the sheets, which, we've been doing 8 years now of monthly shows on there, which are the themed deep dives. And if people want to check out to see what those sound like, there is on patreon.com/between the sheets a whole collection of the shows that we've released as free samples, including our entire series on the 1992 Titan Gate scandals, which we decided to put out for free this year because we wanted more people to listen to and learn from them, and we didn't want to feel like we were asking people to send us money as a consequence of the Janelle Grant lawsuit or anything like that. And there's more. There's more. We have our whole. We have collections up for our WCW themed shows, for our Paul Heyman and Eddie Gilbert themed shows, so people can check those out. And I do want, thank you for having me, and also I want to thank both of you too, just for everything you've said too in promoting, some of the Patreon shows like the Titan Gate shows in the past as well.
I always say required listening, I think, for anyone to understand the true depth of the Ring Boy scandal. If you're looking for more depth than what was, I thought it was just scratching the surface in some of these episodes. I think you could all do yourselves a favor and listen to it. It's not easy listening, but I think it's very important listening. So you can check those out with David Bixenspan and Chris Zellner. And Bix, we always thank you for making time for us, and thanks again for jumping on with us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Bix.
All right. David Bixenspan joining us, and we're going to sign off here, but just some quick notes from today. WWE did confirm Brandon Thurston's earlier reporting a 2-night SummerSlam next year, August 2nd and 3rd, happening at MetLife Stadium in East Rutherford, New Jersey. And this will be in conjunction with, do you have the exact name of
the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority, which is the... They're involved with sporting events and things like that. This was something I said only in audio on Wrestlenomics Radio, but I had been doing some records requests and they were refusing to give me records, and I followed up today, and so we'll try to get some reporting on if there's a site fee or something like that, a subsidy associated with this.
And also, TKO put out a press release this morning. They have now reached a new settlement figure, but just in the Cung Lee case. This is absent the Cajun Johnson case of $375 million payable in installments over an agreed upon period of time. However, the big caveat here is that this is still pending Judge Richard Boulware's approval of this. But this is, the prior amount was $335 million for both cases to be settled. This is $375 just for the Cung Lee case. But until Judge Boulware approves this, there is still a court date for February 3rd of next year. But what this means is that if this is approved, this is a lot more money for the Cung Lee fighters than what was originally going to be the settlement figure. So the ball is in the court once again of Richard Boulware, the most important person in this series of antitrust cases.
Yes. And so this was 335 was both cases before. Now this one alone is going to be 375 million. And yes. I understand the Johnson case is weaker and there's likely to get less money than this, but it's going to be quite a bit more than the first settlement anyway.
The original amount was more weighted towards the Cung Lee fighters, but this is, more money for the Cung Lee fighters, and they are still in, I guess, negotiations on the Cajun Johnson case, which also includes injunctive relief, whereas the Cung Lee case, it's monetary damages. So the Cajun Johnson one is obviously could have, it might not be as easy as a settlement, but, we have been discussing this. It's like the sides are in agreement to settle this. It's Richard Boulware that hasn't felt that this has been a fair terms of the settlements. Coming up, Wei Ting and I are going to be starting, we're going to be doing individual shows for each episode of the Mr. McMahon series starting tomorrow. We're going to do a free release on Friday afternoon covering episode 1, and then at postwrestlingcafe.com, it's $6 to get you in the door there, and we will be doing episodes 2 through 6 with daily releases coming up over the next week. Meanwhile, at Wrestlenomics, this coming Sunday, we are at the final Sunday of the month. So patreon.com/Wrestlenomics for Brandon Thurston.
Get your questions in.
Yes. Brandon at Wrestlenomics.com, correct?
You can email questions to Brandon at Wrestlenomics.com. And if you're a subscriber, you'll listen to the answer.
All right. So check out all of that. Again, thank you to David Bixenspan for joining us. And we'll be back next week in our regular day and time of Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Have a great day.